parents aren't that stupid.
Okay, let me take another perspective on this, because it's a this is one of those research fields where findings are mixed. You can justify almost any position that you have using research and different studies. But the other perspective is the international evidence, that we can see what when we put larger number of countries or education systems together, that what does the international evidence say. And the OECD, that is an Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, very market-oriented international organization, came into a conclusion a couple of years ago that said that the school choice is not associated to improved systems performance. And they found it particularly complicated that the choice in most countries within the OECD is often leading to segregation, and as the OECD is saying, that the segregation, school segregation almost always leads to declining equity, and by equity they mean that how the students' family background determines or explains their educational performance. And again, if you allow me to bring a kind of a international or aliens perspective to the conversation here in the United States, I think that this country and also this state has a huge challenge with equity in education. In other words, to me, it seems like the public education system in the United States as a whole, and in this state particularly, is a fairly unequitable, the word?
Inequitable.
Okay? Inequitable. So if you have this agenda here that on one hand you are looking at enhancing excellence, which is more about how much students learn in the school system and the kind of studies that you have been referring to. But then the other dimension is this enhancing equity. And the OECD, for example, is now saying that excellence and equity go hand in hand. And all of those most successful education systems in the world share the same phenomenon, that they have both equity and quality, high quality learning at the same time. So my question here would be, again, if you can help me to understand that, how the school choice and specifically the charter school idea is affecting the equity in education, and if you see enhancing equity here in the United States as one of the important areas, is the charter school movement, if we do what you have been proposing here to do, is it going to do good for the equity? In other words, make the system more equitable, or the other way around, or does it have any impact on this? But the international evidence is really clear about this, and just yesterday the OECD again published the same type of cross-country international review where they repeated the same thing, that equity should be one of the main policy items in the national agendas, like here in the United States. But now I would like to hear how you see the charter school, school choice in more general, linked to the enhancing equity in the system. Let me start with the panel here, and then I come to the... Okay. Jenny.
I love being called Jenny. So can we just acknowledge that sometimes Pasi Sahlberg looks like he's been plunked down on the moon? So, we have an interesting situation in Massachusetts because our charter sector remains really highly regulated. It's very difficult to open up a charter school here, much more difficult than in other places. And when a charter school opens and fails spectacularly, like one did in Gloucester, where I live, the state moves in pretty quickly. Now, that is not the case in other places. And so we can look overseas to places like Sweden and New Zealand, where choice has been a disaster for education. But all we have to do is look at other cities where this experiment is further along. And what you see there is clear, that schools of choice often mean that the schools themselves have the choice. And so the charters educate a different population of kids, and then you need a sort of reserve system of kids whom the charter schools don't want. And so if you look at a place like Chicago, where there are now whole areas that no longer have open enrollment schools, segregation has actually increased, which is astonishing given how segregated Chicago schools have been historically. There are a number of reasons for this. The choice advocates tend not to believe that segregation is something like a worthy goal for a school. to take on, but it's also a pattern that's built in to a system where the schools do the choosing. This is really different from our original universal idea of education. We're an immigrant state, right? There are kids arriving every day in places like Lawrence and Lynn, and they show up at the public schools, and it doesn't matter whether they haven't even been in a school or what language they speak. The schools have to take them, and it's a challenge and it's a miracle at the same time. That child cannot go to the KIPP school down the street, right? It doesn't work like that. That the school has a higher barrier to entry. That has implications for equity.
For those of you who don't regularly read OECD studies, I can tell you they are no bastion of libertarianism in that organization. And I will also offer to you what I understand the left in this country to understand as equity, which is holding everybody down to the same low standard.
No,
that is my understanding. That is the way. That is what it becomes.
It doesn't mean that equity is not about that.
But that is my judgment. Now let me tell you what the woman Eva Moskowitz said in the Wall Street Journal the other day, talking about her charter schools. 3/4 receive subsidized lunches, 94% are persons of color. They not only rank in the top 1% in math and top 3% in English among all state schools, but they take top honors in national debate and chess championships, and so on. Now, I don't know whether this means that there's increased segregation. I have no idea. I'm not really sure that that's the issue. I think the issue is their scores in math and English and their prospects for success in life as a consequence of being allowed to attend this school as opposed to the district school in which they would otherwise be trapped and where Bill de Blasio would keep them.
Thank you. Just to make sure that everybody is in the same line with the equity. Equity doesn't mean what you said, David. Right. Equity means that we personalize and individualize the service for pupils so that their family background, where they come from, would not determine the educational success or failure. It doesn't mean that we give the same standard, the same things, or hold people at the same standard. That is actually exactly the opposite. That we provide children and people what they need to be successful, and that's something that, again, the international evidence is very clear about this, and that's why I'm curious to hear how people here think about equity through school choice. Anybody else in the panel who would like to take this on, or should I? If not, then I'm happy to.
Questions and we can.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll hold off.
Okay, who would like to go first? Yes.
One thing you did not address is Boston, and I'm not talking about statewide. The city of Boston is a city of very rich and very poor. The very poor go to the public schools, the very rich go to the private schools, and the middle class moves out, okay? According to Marty Walsh, in his State of the City speech, 30% of the kids drop out of high school, don't graduate. 2 of the schools in the city of Boston are the worst rated among the state. So what are you going to do about, and you also haven't addressed, is there a correlation between low IQ and poverty? What do you do about, not everybody can graduate from college. Not everybody can be a rocket scientist. What do you do about low IQ kids? Are our kids stupid? Why are the city of Boston schools, public schools, doing so bad? Do our kids have lower IQs? Or do we have bad teachers? And what about parents that don't care about education and therefore don't instill that in their children?
So I'm a proud Boston public school granny. And my 2 grandchildren, I have 5 grandchildren, 2 of them go to the Boston public schools. And they're getting a phenomenal education. I go to lots of stuff at their school. They go to a pilot school. So there is choice in the Boston public schools without going to a charter school. They're middle-class people who are committed to the Boston public schools. I think there are a lot of people like that. And I think that when stories are told that the Boston public schools are failing, it's really doing a disservice to the children and the families in this city because it's not really, it's manufactured to a large extent. Are there some schools that could do better? Absolutely. But I think that this...
What can the school do that's better? I mean, back then, we don't even have an elementary school. Okay, what can the bad schools do?
I don't know that I think that they're under-resourced. I think that they have challenges that other schools don't have. I think that this gentleman was talking about, he works in a school where 20% of the students are called .4s. That means kids who are essentially in substantially separate classrooms because their disabilities are such that they can't be in regular classrooms. That's a challenge that that school has. When I was a student, those students weren't in school. They were someplace else. So I think that understanding the array of kids that we have in our classrooms today, who should be in our classrooms, I am not for a minute saying they shouldn't be, you have to understand the challenges that children bring with them, and we have to individualize our instruction to a large extent, which is, I think, addressing equity is what Pasi was talking about. How do we teach the child? And it's hard to do that in any kind of a school system, but it's really hard when a class is filled with challenges that are kind of different from one another.
Thank you. Let's take a couple of more from the audience. Yes, please.
Thank you. So thank you for talking to the myth. Thank you for talking to the myth of about the Boston Public Schools. My 2 children have been in the schools for, I think, 14 years, both at a school that was very high poverty, 75% English language learners, over 90% children of color, and they got an incredible education in Boston, and I'm very pleased they're now in high school. I just want to go back to one thing that Jennifer said. I'm a huge fan of the EduShyster.
I'm a huge fan of yours.
Thank you. But I want to question the position that the state does an excellent job of regulating charter schools. And I only know Massachusetts in this regard, but I think that the state has not closed that many charter schools. I think in the last 10 years, it's only been really because of malfeasance,
right. Yeah.
not because of underperformance. There's a charter school in Boston that for over 10 years has really been a very, very poor performer and has not been closed. They're also not held to some of the laws that they should be following. For example, around open meetings. Open board meetings. I have friends of charter schools who try to go to board meetings. They're often not posted legally as they should be. They're not on site. They're sometimes during parent council meetings. And I have one friend who's the only parent who ever goes to the board meetings who feels extremely uncomfortable in that room. They're not following the laws around open meetings. Also, just lastly, I think one problem with charter schools is that every charter school in the state is its own district. That means that if I, as a parent in a charter school, have an issue with my school, I can't go to my local district school board as I can in Boston. I can come down, I can take the T about 25 minutes from my home, I can go to the Boston School Committee, I can speak in an open meeting. If I live in Western Massachusetts, I would need to go to Malden, and I would be going to the state essentially to make a complaint about my school. I don't think that there's very little parent voice in charter schools, and I think that it just is exacerbated by having them all be separate districts. And I'm not sure how the state could possibly regulate an unlimited number of charter schools in the state.
Thank you. One more from the audience. Yes, please.
So I just want to amplify the idea that the people who are talking about policy for charter schools are not people who have been teachers. So when I think of the Bill Gates Foundation, I think of the Broad Foundation, I think of all these foundations, and I think of people who make pronouncements about what teachers are and what teachers do who have not taught in a public school. And when you have taught in a public school, and I've also taught in a charter school, you see a very different reality. And I also teach as a specialist in schools. I'm an enrichment artist kind of person. And so I've recently been teaching in the city of Chelsea, which is a failed, right? It's a failed public school. Those teachers are excellent. Those students are amazing, but they come in every single day. We were teaching in an ELL classroom. They come in and I'd say, oh, hi, first day of school. Yeah, first day of school, first day in the United States, first day of school. And maybe they don't speak Spanish, but I speak a little bit of Spanish. Oh, no, I'm sorry, says the teacher. She speaks Quichua. She speaks a Native American, not even Spanish as her second language. And would you say to a hospital that has many, many people coming to it who are very ill with some specific disease that they were bad hospitals? What are you doing? Why do you have all these people with that bad disease? You're a bad hospital. You should be closed. Open it up to competition. Let other people take over. because you have, 80% of the students are ELL students and have never been to school before. And you're going to test them the same way and say, where's your chess club? Where's your calculus scores? You're bad. You're a failed school. That's nuts. How did we get to this place where we can even be talking this way? It's just crazy.
So I'm still trying to understand why we can't let parents take their kids out of district schools and voluntarily put them in charter schools. They don't like the charter.
Why aren't we doing it?
Why? And then if they don't like the charter school, take the kid back out again. I want somebody to help me understand
Have you
that.
ever been a parent? Let me just say, as a parent, can you imagine being an immigrant parent and you have to find out what this process is, A. You have to have transportation so you can go to wherever your work is and take your children to the charter school, B. Right? It's not an easy thing to do, and it is not something that just every parent can do.
Well, let's make it easier and open more charter schools.
Why don't you fully fund the schools like they do in Finland equally? Why don't you do that? Why we would never have had busing or anything.
Okay.
Put that money in. It's very easy to find segregated schools with either all black children with all. I worked in a school with kids from El Salvador and Colombia almost exclusively. You already have your ideal little setting for children with language needs, emotional needs, economic needs. Why don't some of those businesses just, as a gift, give money to those schools? And if the parents like it, the children will stay longer. I'm sure they will. Why doesn't that happen? That's a really interesting question to me because who are we serving? And we are not even talking about the children. Well, we're talking about the data, but we're not talking about the children.
Right.
Why don't you give money to those schools? They certainly could be fixed up.
Okay, before we move forward, is there anybody else in the panel who would like to comment? I don't want to hold you
Comment
back.
on that?
Yes.
Well, I mean, one of the myths that's out there is that our charters in Boston serve not just the same population of kids, but they do it with the same resources. And there's an elaborate sort of ecosystem of funders and donors that give to charters. And so I'm engaged with a lot of charter advocates, and I correspond regularly with charter teachers, and one invited me to the Brook School in Roslindale last year. I happily went, and I came away and I felt so sad because I just thought, like, man, if kids in other Boston schools could have the kinds of resources that this school has, because the school is beloved by businesses, by foundations. Every time I'm constantly reading about another big grant that they've gotten. They have one of the only 2 complete marimba sets in New England. And it's just, when the Dearborn, I went to the Dearborn when they were about to announce which charter management organization would be taking over. They had one working water fountain, and the people were trying to figure out why the water coming out of it was yellow. Businesses are giving all sorts of money, but not to the traditional public schools.
Jonathan?
Well, I'm just thinking of Massachusetts as opposed to Boston as such, and we've had the building program that has been very substantial for public schools, and so the narrative that our schools are all decrepit and the water fountains don't work, undoubtedly there are anecdotes of that, but I'm not sure that that's the way we've headed in Massachusetts the last several years. It's also not at all clear that when you hugely upgrade a school that it suddenly has a major effect on performance either, of course. But,
Okay, thank you.
But it's certainly safer.
Okay, let's take 2 people from you, sir, and then we go here, and then go to the other side. So 3 people.
So I wanted to follow up on the debate. I came in late, so I don't know your names, but I'd say you, Ms., and say you, sir.
Yeah, we can hear you.
The argument that was put forth when in a defense of charter schools over there was only an argument for private schools. And there are different things. In one case, the state is providing significant resources to this. But whether private schools should exist along with public schools is a separate issue entirely. We can debate that. There are issues, I would think, let's say in New York City, for instance, comes to mind, where there's going to be a sharp divide between the kind of people who attend private schools and people who attend public schools. But that's not what we're debating. We're debating what the state's resources should be going to. Should it be going to a public school that's regulated as, let's say, a public entity that follows the same rules of transparency and regulations, or if it should be going to a privately managed entity? People, if they don't want their children to go to a public school, they can pay out of their own pocket for a private school. We're not arguing, that to my knowledge, is not part of the debate of what we're talking about. It's the direction of state resources. So, so again, the defense of charter schools that I saw was only a defense of private schools, not the direction of state funds. An additional point, going off the kind of prior discussion of transparency I had seen, I believe this has been in a few states. I can't remember them off the top of my head, but there have been lawsuits in which courts actually ruled that charter schools were not subject to standard laws of kind of, let's say, public records laws that you would normally say that a public school would be, right? Since as a public entity, it is going to have to be responsible to the public. You will have to follow certain rules of kind of transparency and disclosure. But charter schools, as private entities, although private entities receiving public funding, were not, and that's a pretty glaring discrepancy.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I'd like to say that my daughter attends a failing public school in Roxbury that was 5th in growth last year out of the state, out of 1,900 schools, 1,934. We're a failing school. We're a full inclusion school. Our kids will never test the way other schools test. But that's all they look at. They just look at the test scores. And I really don't think that's fair. I have issues with, you say you want to open up seats in charter schools. For every 6 kids that leave my daughter's school to go to a charter, we lose the equivalent amount of funding of a teacher. So, you know, over the years, if the charter schools keep promoting their excellence and excellence and excellence, of course people are drawn to that, and they will go that way. So it's to the point now where the parents are buying the pencils and paper in order to give the school enough money to keep teachers in the classroom. I've always been most concerned with the funding issue. I don't really care about the rest of it as long as my daughter's school has the funding it needs to buy copier ink. And the thing about opening up seats in schools, what I'm seeing here is a lot of empty seats on this too.
Right. Can I speak to that? Because they never have, it's to me, that's the thing that shocked me the most when I started looking at these numbers that I truly didn't expect to find. But, and I really did pick City on a Hill kind of arbitrarily, because I usually pick on Match, and I decided not to pick on them for a change. So City on a Hill has a charter that allows them to have 280 students. But they plan for attrition because they take in way more kids. So if you look at the chart on the left, for the class of 2014, I apologize that you need a microscope practically, but it's the bar. It's the chart on the left, and it's the bar over to the left. So in that class, there were 112 kids taken in the 9th grade. Remember, this is a charter that has 280 seats. So when that class came in as 9th graders, there were 122 kids that were taken into the class. And when that class walked across the stage last year, when that class had the October 1 enrollment last year, because I don't have the graduation rates, this is right off of the Department of Ed data set, 56 of those kids were left. But they always had 280 kids in the seats so that they could get their $4.4 million from the state. And so, to me, this is planning for people to leave, and that's what the Boston Foundation meant by selective outmigration of low achievers. The low achievers are going out, so when we can claim 100% of our kids go to college, 100% of the kids who are left go to college. 100%, and it's really deceptive advertising, if nothing else. as a parent, I'm not going to send my child to a school if my child only has a 50% chance of being successful. I want my child to be successful from day one. I want that school to pay attention to my child from day one to day whatever 13 times 180 is, because I don't do math publicly. And that's what I expected when my kids were in school, and that's what I expect for my grandchildren. And that's what I would argue everyone expects for their children. And I think that this is deceptive.
I have just a quick follow-up to that. When City on a Hill applied to the state to open up a new high school in New Bedford, it was fascinating. In their application, they predicted 65% attrition. So that was not an imaginary finding on your part. That's built into the model.
And I say that, I don't think, given the 2010 law, that they should have been given 2 more charters, because I think it's in violation of the law. So I would argue that the Department of Ed isn't paying as close attention to this stuff as they're supposed to be. But
Thank you. We have time for a couple of more questions from you, and then we start to wind up so that you can go home on time. Yes, sir.
Is this on?
Hold it next to you.
Professor Turk, I'd like to ask you a question which is sort of a follow-on to what Jennifer actually began with. She mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, that each era, each epoch makes certain demands, on education, certainly in American society, where unlike I think Finland, we try to educate all children. But maybe you're better than other European countries. My understanding is that what we're trying to do in a democracy is educate everyone. So she mentioned that in the 1920s, the earlier period, that with the immigration, which of course we don't have now, but with immigration, that part of the concern about public education was to not just integrate people into society, but to create, what can I say, citizens in a functioning democracy. And as I understand it, we have, at this point in time, the most inequitable, in terms of income disparity, that we've had in a very, very long time. So, Professor Turk, since I think you understand this money stuff, that's what the economic language was about, could you explain to me, if you will, the relationship between the market and enhanced democratic opportunity and values? Could you explain that?
I can only explain it in terms of what I see as the tragedy of the inner city, which I think is rooted in single-parent families, the decline of the family in the inner city. There were 2-parent households back in the 50s and 40s and so on. Those have disappeared now from the minority population in the inner city. Frequently, kids that grow up in single-parent households haven't got a chance. It doesn't matter whether there's a charter school or a district school. The parents are not going to make the kids study. Now, there are parents who want to get their kids out of these environments that many public schools have where studying isn't cool. And they want to get them out of that environment, and they want to get them into schools where they will be, where the school will support the parents' determination to give the kid a chance. And that's what I think charter schools and private schools in general are all about. I am sorry that the public schools have this impossible problem of trying to inspire kids that go home and where there's the boyfriend is there and maybe he's a crack dealer. This is not an. Okay, so I'm sorry I'm telling the truth, but there is a tragedy going on in the inner city. The charter school offers one opportunity for parents who care to get their kids out of the low-performing schools and into a better environment. And that's my answer to your question.
What about all the people who make less than minimum wage and have to afford the housing in the city of Boston that is skyrocketing? Do you live in an apartment where you have to work 3 jobs and then see your kids go to school?
I understand.
The best you can. There are very many people out there that face that.
I understand, but I'm
living with crack dealers, and they're not single parent households either.
There are plenty of single-parent households in the minority community.
Barack Obama came from one.
You know, I taught in the Somerville public schools, and I would say I think the poverty rate is around 60% in the city, but I taught in schools where pretty much 100% of the kids are on free and reduced price lunch. And I would say that my experience of urban parents is that they love their children as much as rich people do, and they might actually love them more because they work multiple jobs to put a roof over their heads and clothes on their back and food on the table. And working hard when you're poor means you're doing really hard work. And you can't engage with the school the way middle class and upper middle class parents are able to do on a daily basis. And I think judging the poor by the same standard as you judge middle class and upper middle class people is inherently unfair. And I have to say, David, I find some of your comments to be a tinge on the racist side, and I don't know if you intend it to be that way, but I have to say I'm actually offended by the way you've characterized people who, in my estimation, are trying as hard as they possibly can to make sure that their kids have a leg up in the world.
Earlier discussion about why charter schools why it's even a question about whether we should have charter schools. The original idea of charter schools that Schenker had, of course, were quite different than what we now have today. I don't have any issues personally with a number of individual charter schools. The idea of schools being able to do something that's a little different, try things differently, I think it's a great model. We also have, for advanced charter schools, we have pilot schools, we have innovation schools. There are other ways to do that within the public school system. That, in and of itself, I don't think is the issue. I think the issue is that charter schools are promoted as a way of saving public education, of saving education, depublicizing, what's the word?
Depublicizing, I don't know.
Privatizing education because of the crisis, so-called, of education. And as Berliner's book said, and that was, 20 years ago that he wrote The Manufacturing Crisis?
Yeah, a long time ago, yeah.
It's been a while. This is not new.
No.
But when you look at districts around the country that have gone to, have opened many charter schools, unlike Massachusetts, which has a relatively small number, it has not been a good thing for the families in those communities. You look at Chicago, you look at Philadelphia, you look at Camden, New Jersey, you look at New Jersey. It is eliminating choice for those families. But what it has done is privatized the schools. They've laid off teachers, closed public schools, laid off hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of teachers, and then turned around and opened charter schools. They closed public schools because there wasn't enough, they couldn't afford them, they didn't have the budget and all. They turn around and open up charter schools, have them staffed with a lot of Teach for America teachers and other young teachers that are much less expensive to hire, who don't stick around long enough to have pension costs that are going to pile up. That's where charter schools are coming from. And for Massachusetts, I think to go in that direction of increasing the cap to the high level things that our states have is a way of saying we're not committed to public education. And for the state that produced Horace Mann to say that publicly funded education for all of our children is not our number one goal, that's a travesty.
Thank you. Can I ask the panel, we have a few minutes time to reflect a little bit on either this conversation that we have had, or if you want help me to understand a little bit what's next for the public school here in Massachusetts or the United States. So you have a minute or two, each of you, and then we close.
I was interested in the last set of comments because, of course, charter schools are publicly funded education. That is correct. That's correct. But they do, at least the potential that they've had is that they allow considerable amount of innovation. When it comes to equity, they hold the promise of the ability to tailor better to the needs. Some people want more arts, some people want more vocational education. That seems to me an entirely appropriate component of equity. As a practical matter in Massachusetts, we have permitted charter schools in poorer areas of the state rather than the richer areas, and I would argue that that may well have provided more choices for people who haven't otherwise had choices. And I think Now, that doesn't mean that we only want to go that way. And I'm less and less of a fan of, say, vouchers, because that would allow it would allow religious schools, which, I've just come back from France, my wife is French. French system provides choice. You can choose to go to a state school, a secular school, or you can go to a religious school. And the religious schools are largely subsidized by the state. And although the French protest that there's a separation of church and state, obviously this is incompatible with that concept. And I do believe that one of the problems that France faces is precisely that it has a whole set of schools that are religiously driven, and that leads to a greater sectarianism than our public education. And I would argue that charter schools are a compromise. They are not going to a sectarianism that we want to avoid, because that's not how we knit together an America. But they do provide the potential for innovation and choice, and within at least the current parameters have pushed us quite a lot that way. And some of the things like pilot schools and maybe the lengthening of the workday arguably come from the pressures of competition that charter schools have given us.
Okay, thank you. Jenny?
I just love this panel. I could sit here all night, and I am particularly enamored of this gentleman. I cannot understand who punched you in the eye. I want to have a word with whoever that was. You were profoundly misunderstood.
Apparently it was well justified.
So actually, you know, it's interesting. I went to the National Charter School Conference in Las Vegas this summer, and you could really feel that the early part of the charter movement, when the emphasis was on letting 100 flowers of innovation bloom, it's really over. And now our urban charters all look remarkably similar. And in Boston, they're very similar. They have very strict discipline, long day, long year, and a real emphasis on producing high test scores. And one of the implications of that for this conversation about equity is that it means that if you have the misfortune of being born into poverty, something you have no control over, you're going to receive a very particular kind of education. You're going to get an overwhelming focus on math and English. You're going to get an elaborate architecture of reward and punishment. You're going to get a silent lunch. But if you're lucky enough to be born in Wellesley, you get your whole child educated. You get to take robotics. You get to do a hands-on science project, and that is an equity issue. The solution that we're fixated on is actually creating new gaps in the name of eliminating earlier gaps. And so I hope we start to have a more realistic conversation about where all this is heading. We've got a very well-funded, very well-organized campaign to raise the cap on charter schools in Massachusetts that will be kicking into high gear imminently. And I do hope that we turn to two very key issues. And one is early childhood, where so much of this stuff is absolutely essential, and revisiting our now very outdated school financing formula. So if I'm able to influence the course of events, both of those things will happen.
Thanks. David, a minute.
Well, if I'm going to be accused of being a racist, I suppose I should be pleased it comes from a union official. The point is, of course, that single-parent households, although way too prevalent among the non-minority community, are far more among the minority community, and single-parent households are automatically at a disadvantage. Charter schools offer an opportunity for the heads of those households who want to give their kids a better break to get a better break. I don't know if that makes me a racist, because I feel bad for minority students that are trapped in failing public schools, and I'd like to see them get into performing charter schools, but if that makes me a racist, then I will accept the label.
Kathy?
If I were going to recommend something to read before you go to bed tonight, it would be Kay Merceth's book called Inside High Performing Charter Schools. Kay's on the faculty at the Harvard Grad School of Ed with Posse. And she describes 6 schools in Massachusetts, and what you learn is that there isn't much innovation going on. It's kind of a drill and kill, low cognitive demand instruction geared toward helping kids to pass a test. And there are actually sample lessons in there, so as an English teacher looking at the English lessons, I would be mortified if anybody thought that that was all I was capable of doing with urban kids. It's really low-cog stuff. So I would recommend that, and you judge for yourself if you think that it's innovative, but I would argue no.
Thank you very much, everybody. My last previous experience with the charter schools a couple of weeks ago in New York City, a student of mine actually took me to see one of the public schools there. And it was a strange place because it was in Harlem, in the middle of Harlem, and this public school had been forced to give room for 2 charter schools. There were many weird things there, like the charter school pupils were wearing a certain colored T-shirts, and they never mixed the kids with the public school kids out of the yard. The schoolyard was divided. It's like a completely segregated community. Teachers never spoke to one another. There was one floor in the school that was a kind of a no-go zone. I wanted to see the whole school, and I was told that you're going to go there. If you go, it's a police issue. But the saddest thing in that particular school was when I sat down with the public school principal there, she said that every 1st of November, when she comes to school, there's a line of kids there and parents from these charter schools to be located into her school, because what she said is that the charter schools, they remove those children that they don't want to have there. And so she has to take these kids. If this is the part of the charter school movement here, I don't think that I like the idea too much. But I also know from my experience in other states that there's some wonderful work going on in many of the schools in Minnesota, for example. So for me, this whole charter school issue is a kind of interesting and also difficult thing to fully understand. We would never have any conversation like this in Finland, whether the content or style. But I appreciate different opinions and views that you have had, and I have learned a great deal here from you, and I can only wish that everything will go finely tonight with the President's address, and afterwards when you go and start to do the work. Do you want to say something? Or?
It's really, the charter school movement is a movement to privatize education, and whether we go on the little points back and forth, or this charter school did this and didn't do that, and all the little bits and pieces of the research. If you look at the big picture, it's a movement to get rid of the public schools and privatize as much as they can and make as much money off the testing and all the other materials and to take control of the education system. So we can go back and forth on all these little points between charter schools, but you cannot forget the big picture. Okay? Schools are being taken over and privatized.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you,
panel.
Professor Sahlberg. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to all the panelists. Great discussion. Before we wrap the panel, I also want to recognize City Councilor Josh Zakum, who stepped in during the beginning of the discussion. Don't worry, he was here for most of the discussion, so he gets credit. I am eternally grateful as the chair of the committee to the Suffolk University Law School for allowing us to use this space, which is fantastic space, so thank you. To the Ward 5 committee members, just make sure, a couple things. First of all, I want to make sure you check in with Chris Donnelly to make sure that he knows you're here. The secretary has informed me that actually the one item that was on the agenda we don't have to cover. So I'm going to call the meeting to order, and without objection, we'll table the agenda and ask for a motion to adjourn. Motion made by Amelia Colano, seconded by Mike Dash. Mike Dash. All those in favor say aye. We are adjourned. Let's go watch the president. Thank you very much.